In his book, The Catholic Church and Conversion, G.K. Chesterton wrote, "It is impossible to be just to the Catholic Church. The moment a man ceases to pull against it, he feels a tug towards it. The moment he ceases to shout it down, he begins to listen to it with pleasure. The moment he tries to be fair to it, he begins to be fond of it." Francis Beckwith on reverting to the Catholic faith now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Francis Joseph Beckwith is a philosopher who teaches and writes on a variety of topics and issues in ethics, law, politics, and religion. Since 2003, he has been on the faculty of Baylor University, where he currently serves as professor of philosophy and church-state studies, affiliate professor of political science, resident scholar in the Institute for Studies of Religion, and associate director of graduate studies in philosophy. He has held visiting faculty appointments at Princeton University, the University of Notre Dame, and the University of Colorado. With a PhD and an MA in philosophy from Fordham University, he holds the Master of Juridical Studies degree from the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. The author of over 100 academic articles, book chapters, reference entries, and reviews, among his over 20 books, are Defending Life, A Moral and Legal Case Against Abortion Choice, and Taking Rights Seriously, Law, Politics, and the Reasonableness of Faith, both published by Cambridge University Press, and most recently, Never Doubt Thomas, The Catholic Aquinas as Evangelical and Protestant, published by Baylor University Press in 2019. Francis and his wife, Frankie, live in Woodway, Texas. His website is francisbeckwith.com. Frank Beckwith, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Segment 1. Drawn to the Jesus People. It happened in late 1973, Frank Beckwith writes, right around the time of my 13th birthday, when I was drawn from the Catholicism of my youth to the world of evangelical Protestantism by way of a Jesus People church in downtown Las Vegas. The church, called Maranatha House, was a non-denominational community founded by ex-hippies who had come out of the counterculture to follow Jesus. It was very much like the portrayal of the early days of Calvary Chapel in the 2023 movie Jesus Revolution. The church's services consisted almost entirely of contemporary praise, music, petitionary, and contemplative prayer, and sermons that emphasized the exposition of Scripture and its practical application. Although I was deeply moved, Frank writes, by these services, I gravitated to Maranatha's tape and book library. It was there where I was in my element. So, Frank, tell us a little bit to begin with. Tell us a little bit about the contrast between the Mass of your youth and the services of Maranatha during your teenage years.
Yeah, so, I just remember as a kid, I didn't realize at the time, but looking back, the way in which I interpreted my experience at Maranatha House was actually through a Catholic lens. Obviously everything I knew about Jesus and what I believed about Scripture was informed by what I had learned as a Catholic. Right. But the one thing that did differ, and I think it had a lot to do with the time in which this occurred in the early 1970s, I had a real hunger to follow Jesus. I was really drawn to the New Testament. My parents had left on their kitchen table one of those old Good News for Modern Man New Testaments that they had picked up from a friend who had been involved with the Catholic charismatic movement. And I began reading it and was just drawn to the person of Christ. And the one thing that the Maranatha House folks had was this very living, serious commitment to following Jesus. And it seemed to me, at least in the Catholic world, which I inhabited in the early 1970s, that it wasn't like that there was, to a certain extent, a kind of watering down of the seriousness of following Jesus. Now, that's coming from somebody looking back at his 12-year-old self. So,
sure.
I don't want to give anyone the impression that there weren't serious Catholics. In fact, I've come to realize that there were many more than I had suspected. But I wonder sometimes whether this is just something it happens when you're young, right? You just simply are drawn to novelty.
Right.
But, in fact, I remember thinking about wanting to be a priest, because that was the only way. You're a young Catholic male, and you think, I want to follow Jesus. And the way in which that is most exemplified in your life is the priesthood.
Yeah.
And I never really talked to anyone about that, but I wound up going to Maranatha House through the friend of my parents who had left that New Testament Bible in the kitchen. And he was a Catholic gentleman who was deeply involved with the Catholic charismatic movement, but spent Thursday evenings at this place called Maranatha House, which was, as you said, quoting from the piece, a non-denominational community. It was Protestant, but there were many Catholics that were involved at that time. And so that line between Catholic and Protestant was not that pronounced to me when I was that young. In fact, I wound up attending a Bible study that was led by a Catholic couple that included Protestants and Catholics. And it was part of that whole Catholic charismatic movement that had an ecumenical feel to it.
And one of the things you said, Frank, too, is that when you went to I keep calling it Maranatha, but you say Maranatha. When you went there, there was especially the tape and book library where you felt like you were in your element. Again, here you are, you're a 13-year-old boy, and you're reading Good News for Modern Man left on the table at your family's house, and having a hunger to be a follower of Jesus, and then you're drawn into some of the academic works or the intellectual treasure trove, of religion you're coming across. What did you read when you're at Maranatha? What did you read? What did you listen to? How did that, at this stage in your life, how did it affect you?
Yeah, so there were several different types of books that I was drawn to. One type of genre was the kind of end times literature that was really popular at the time. Things like Late Great Planet Earth. There was an author named Salem Kerbin who authored two novels. One was called 666 and the other 1000. It was basically deeply influenced by a way of looking at scripture and history that was dominant in kind of popular evangelicalism. It was called dispensationalism. So that was one type of literature. And that I don't know how much it really influenced me, but it was sort of interesting. But then I was drawn to certain popular speakers that dealt with questions concerning issues of faith and reason. So some of the tapes that I listened to and books that I read were by figures like Walter Martin. Walter Martin was the founder of Christian Research Institute, and he had a radio program called The Bible Answer Man. And he died in 1989. He was 59 years old. He died much too young.
Wow.
And he was his successor was a guy named Hank Hanegraaff, who currently runs CRI. And Hank himself actually has converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is interesting kind of turn of events. But so it was Martin, John Warwick Montgomery, who was a Lutheran theologian and a popular speaker. There were books by figures like Norman Geisler, and figures like R.C. Sproul, who was a kind of reformed writer. And as a 13-year-old, I read these books not with any sort of interest in the internal disputes among Protestants. I just was sort of hungry for ways to best explain and understand the intellectual credentials of my faith. So, I was drawn to this place because of the kind of spiritual expression of the faith. But I also had this kind of intellectual side to me that wanted answers, right? So when someone would say to me, the Bible is God's word, I would why should I believe that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I, as I say in the piece, I was drawn to this desire for rest in God,
Mm.
but at the same time, I kind of was a curious kid. In fact, my mother tells me when I uh, was about to receive my first Holy Communion, I was asked by all of us were asked by our, I think it was, what was it, second grade teacher I think that's when they did
Sure.
the Holy Communion in those days, but they may still do it at that age now.
Yep.
So second grade teacher asked each of us what gift we should receive from our parents, and everyone asked for a medal, and I asked for a Bible. And so even from that young age, I sort of was interested in the content of faith.
Yeah. Frank, so there you're going to Maranatha, and you're kind of getting fed, and you're getting your intellect, stimulated and so on. Are you circling back to your Catholic Church, the Mass, conversation? Is there something at the Catholic Church that's offering something comparable? Even at that young age, a youth group or a priest that's accessible, or by the way, you could read this as the deacon or what have you. And we're going to get into some of your experiences in the Catholic school in just a second. But at the church itself, the parish itself, would you go back there and search for it there? Or are you like, I'm getting fed at Maranatha. I go to Mass here at the church, but I go for my intellectual formation over here in Maranatha. What was your sense?
Yeah, so I went to, no, there was nothing like youth groups or anything like that. I don't, at least if there were, they weren't brought to my attention.
Sure.
I remember after and before Mass, though, gravitating to the section in the back of the church that had all these magazines and books. And I remember paging through them and reading them. In fact, I don't have it anymore, but I through the numerous moves my wife and I have made over the years, you lose things. But I had carried with me for many years some of the books that I had picked up, including one little catechism book. And I forget the name of the priest that had authored it, and I've actually looked him up, and he was a pretty solid guy. So I'm happy that I actually did carry that with me for years. So but there was a moment or a brief period of time where my mom in particular, in fact, I shared this story at the beginning of my book, Never Doubt Thomas. The Dominicans from Northern California had organized a retreat at my parents' parish for, I think, 4 or 5 days. It was every evening, I think Monday, I don't know, Thursday through Saturday. I forget the exact days. And my mom encouraged me to go, and I went every single night, and I brought my big leather Bible with me. And I remember this is one of these memories that's so vivid, because I remember the priest in his friar outfit and his large rosary and the rope that he wore, and I remember arguing with him about something in the Bible, and he said, well, the Bible teaches that there is no God. And he pulled, I think it was in the book of Psalms, it says, the fool in his heart says there is no God. He said, you have to remember the context of things in Scripture. And that kind of stuck with me. I mean, forever. And it didn't move me back to the church, but I did leave that evening really liking the Dominicans.
You've got a Dominican sound to, I mean, the way you're probing and the life of the mind and so on. I think that's amazing. So what's interesting here is I want to say to people who are listening out there, if your teenage son is asking these great questions and is searching and so on, he may just be destined to be an academic great like Frank Beckwith. So just know that it's a very auspicious beginning to be a searcher at that young age. I want to circle back to your Catholic school. So here you are having kind of this experience over at Maranatha, and all the while you're attending Catholic school, and you relayed in this essay you wrote for us at Evangelization Culture the story about a nun who taught your 7th grade religion class, and just say a few words about how she would handle your theological and biblical inquiries.
Yeah, so in fact, she actually just recently she just passed away a couple of years ago, which she lived until her mid-90s, and so. Yeah, so I would go back to my religion class and ask questions about aspects of things that I had learned at Maranatha House or I'd heard about, and she largely dismissed them and didn't really provide any serious answers. In fact, there was one occasion, I don't share this in the story, where, again, I don't really remember all the details of it, but my mother, before she passed away, shared with me a story that she actually called the nun up and was upset with her, saying, you should not have treated my son this way.
Wow.
And so it was, I refer to the nun as I kind of give a description in the article. She was one of those habitless. So if you had seen her in the mall, you would just think that she was just a middle-aged woman who was not religious. And for me, there was a big change, because we had at the school that I had attended for 12 years or 8 years, for the first 5 years, we had nuns, sisters that were from the Philippines, and they dressed in full habit.
Yeah. And
they had pretty serious religion classes. In fact, I remember I had done something wrong, and I was forced to have to kneel in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary and to pray. And so, and all of a sudden, after 5th grade, they were gone. And they were replaced by a different order of nuns from the Midwest that did not wear habits. Now, looking back, some of those nuns are actually quite good. I remember taking a science class from one nun that was actually quite impressive. And I remember dissecting a pig.
Yeah.
As part of the class. And I don't know, at 11, I could do it. I don't think I can do it at 63. I don't know what it is when you're 11-year-old, you can sort of do that, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think that there was a real sea change at the school, one that reflected at least some people's understanding of the changes that were going on in the church in general. And I want to be careful here. I say because I do. I try to be careful in the article. I don't want to say, oh, if only things had remained the same, I would never have left the church. I don't know that. Yeah, and nobody does. And there is a tendency among at least some reverts to sort of, say if only catechesis were better, I wouldn't have left. We just don't know, because look, the people that wound up making certain sorts of changes that were, in my judgment, not consistent with the Second Vatican Council, although claiming that they were consistent, they themselves grew up in the era in which there were, the so-called Golden Age. So, we have to be careful. There's a lot of things going on when people change their minds or are, thinking about leaving the church that aren't purely intellectual, that just aren't a matter of the right type of catechesis. As St. Thomas teaches us in the Summa Theologica, and as the church teaches, that human beings, although we have the ability to reason, we are also organic beings that can be overcome by emotion. It can be influenced by culture. we're not purely rational. And so
Yeah.
to sort of frame everything as, oh, if you just had been taught the right lessons. No, there's more going on than that, than just the intellectual life.
By the way, on that note, there's a great quote from Jacques Barzin, the storied history professor, I think, out of Columbia, when someone said, man is reasonable, and he paused, he interrupted the person and said, capable of reason. It's not that he's reasonable, he's capable of it, and many times he's capable of being irrational. So to your point, there's a lot more that goes into it than just intellectual apprehension and practice based on intellect and so on. I also want to say another word, that my daughters go to a Catholic school up here in Minneapolis, and and we have a wonderful nun, Sister Amelia, who frequents the halls and runs kind of retreats and spends time with the kids, and she's dressed in full habit. And I will just say that when you walk into a school and you see a nun, just beaming, big smile, and dressed in a habit, it changes the way you look at her. It renders a model of and I'm not saying that the people who are without habits have less holiness, but I'm just saying there is a model of holiness. There's a commitment to the point of wearing something that runs fully countercultural, kind of through your day, through the halls, and so on. And it changes the way you live. I think it changes the way you perceive someone who can do that and does do that. So there is something very special about that habit and about the joy that comes forward to committing yourself in that fashion. So I understand what you're saying in that respect. Again, not taking away from the holiness of those who are without habits, but it's just an extraordinary model for those that do have them. I want to move into high school for 1 second. I know high school didn't get much better. I want you, and again, I know that we're couching that you had a wonderful friends, I'm sure many good teachers, but let's talk a little bit about how were you formed in your Catholic school. What was the Catholic intellectual tradition that was being offered you? What books and films were you being immersed in?
Yeah, so it's actually, the high school I attended is actually much better than it was in terms of the Catholic formation that when I was there in the late 1970s. Although I have several friends who went to same high school with me, including the Archbishop of Portland, Alexander Sample. We're both classmates, and he tells me that when he felt called to the priesthood, he met privately with one of the teachers who was a priest from Poland who was quite devout. So there were things that I just wasn't aware of.
Sure.
That that there were some real stellar individuals there. But my first year and second year religion classes had there was nothing about the Catholic intellectual tradition. We discussed in my freshman class mostly contemporary moral issues. So I remember being on a panel on whether premarital sex was right. And so I took the position that it wasn't right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was on the same, so there were I had three debate partners who debated 4 other students who took the position that premarital sex was okay.
Oh, wow.
And the teacher, who was the varsity basketball coach, who had no theological education, took no position. And and then in my sophomore year, we read this collection of essays that included a story which is actually quite famous called The Lottery, and it's about a small town that every year there's a lottery to select a citizen that is stoned. That is doesn't take a lot of drugs. They are actually literally stones are thrown at them.
With stones, yes.
And it's part of the town's tradition. And I think the subtext to that is that tradition is bad. I think that reading, as I got, a couple of years ago when I was working on my book, Return to Rome, about my reversion, I, got online and thought, well, I wonder if there are people talk about this essay, The Lottery, and sure enough, the interpretation, general interpretation, it's a sort of attack on tradition. And then we read Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which, I've not actually read it since my sophomore year in high school, but it was a very popular book at the time, and I can't even tell you what it was about. But it was not. It was apparently kind of like there was a spiritual aspect to it, kind of secular, mystical stuff, but nothing to do whatsoever with the Catholic intellectual tradition. I was not exposed to anything remotely like the Catechism. There wasn't anything about, we would never have heard anything about Augustine or Aquinas or
Sure.
what the meaning of the Mass is or anything like that. And so there wasn't really anything that I recall. I did go through a kind of crisis of faith during that time. I kind of drifted away from Maranatha House, and in roughly my sophomore year, I considered myself a kind of agnostic. At least that's what I said. Looking back, I just think I was just a kid that was frustrated and not really sure about life. And so I poured myself into athletics. I had actually, starting roughly in ninth grade, I became a fanatic for basketball and practiced all the time, and eventually made the varsity team and played. I was on the track team and the cross country team. So I became a 3-sport letterman and really was into athletics. And then it was only in my senior year that I began rethinking rethinking Christianity. And I did eventually return to Christianity, but not to Catholicism.
Segment 2, Formation and Faithlessness. It was in high school, recalls Frank Beckwith, during my middle 2 years that I abandoned faith altogether, labeling myself as agnostic. So Frank, you did a perfect lead into what I was moving into. So thank you. You anticipated very well. I want to ask you. You alluded to this a little bit. Was it a decisive break with your faith, or was it more of an atrophy? Or what would you say?
I say it was the kind of, I guess, emotional reaction that one has when that's not really fully serious.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of thing when, I guess the best explanation is something like this. Supposing you're a high school sophomore and you're a male and you discover that a girl likes you, and you kind of like her, but you don't like the fact that you like her. So you put on airs that you, that's basically the best analogy. It's like, so you kind of are standoffish and so it's like you don't like the fact that you may very well like her. So I do think so I would say I just don't like God.
Yeah.
I think that's, I think just the experience of years has allowed me to better interpret that. So if you had asked my 15-year-old self, I would have no clue.
Yeah.
But I think looking back, that's exactly what it was. It's the kind of, it's almost like you hear these stories of people that are dyed-in-the-wool atheists, and all of a sudden they have a quick conversion.
Yeah.
Well, why is that? They probably were God intoxicated.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yep.
And so they just, that there's just a moment of a kind of road to Damascus sort of thing. So I do think that if I had to sort of interpret my younger self's emotional reactions, I think that's the right way to look at it. I don't think I really was an unbeliever. I don't think I was intellectually convinced of the non-existence of God or anything like that. I still attended Mass with my parents. I mean, as out of respect for their faith. I lived in their home. They were paying my tuition for high school, and I went to Mass with them still out of respect. But that didn't, by the end of my senior year, I prayed. I remember praying, asking God to help reveal reveal yourself to me, help my faith.
Yeah.
And then eventually made contact with some of the folks that I had known at Maranatha House, and they put me in contact with certain evangelicals that lived in Las Vegas. And I began attending a couple of different evangelical churches in Vegas towards the end of my senior year, and then into college. I went to University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, lived at home with my parents, and became active in a couple of different evangelical churches, and eventually changed my major to philosophy, because those intellectual interests never really waned. And I was told by several friends, well, if you're interested in pursuing an academic career as a theologian, you should major in philosophy. And that's when I really became more and more interested in figures like Augustine and Aquinas. And in fact, it was a course, it was a combination of a course in medieval philosophy that I took at UNLV and hanging out at the local Christian bookstore. There was a local Christian bookstore called the Archives, which was actually named after a bookstore that was at a big mega church in Southern California called Melodyland. And they had this kind of legendary Christian bookstore that had a lot of really serious books. And this is long before Amazon.com. And so you couldn't just get online and order serious books. You had to either count on your local bookstore having them or ordering them. Or in my case, I would drive to Southern California with some friends and we'd spend a whole day at Archives. Yeah. And shop and get these books. Well, they opened up an Archives bookstore in Las Vegas, and then there was another bookstore called Christian Supply Center, and so I would go there, and there was one person that worked there and at the other bookstore that put me in contact, because I told them what I was interested in, and they said, "Oh, you should read these books," and it was there that I became reacquainted with the work of Norm Geisler, who I had just really listened to his tapes that I picked up at Maranatha House. But at these bookstores, I'd actually get his books. And there was another author named Ronald Nash, who was a evangelical philosopher who I began reading. Geisler was a self-identified evangelical Thomist. And Ronald Nash was a self-identified evangelical Augustinian who was also a Platonist. So he was somebody that appropriated the ideas of Plato to his theological project. And I didn't realize it at the time how unusual that was in the evangelical world. Most evangelical theologians did not think that you should engage and appropriate philosophical ideas in the formation of your theology. That's a very common thing for Catholics to think, right? I mean, in fact, looking back historically at the formation and development of Christian doctrine, you can't understand the early Catholic creeds without understanding the deep philosophical influence of Greek thought. Right? So you can't understand the Nicene Creed without understanding the way in which the church appropriated the concepts of Greek thought in its better understanding of doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation. So every week, every Sunday, we say the Son is consubstantial with the Father. Right. That term consubstantial is a technical philosophical term. It isn't just sort of a throwaway line, that you can replace with anything else. So I began reading those thinkers and not realizing it, that I was actually constitutionally thinking more like a Catholic. But I didn't realize it. I just still, consider myself an evangelical, majored in philosophy, and eventually graduated from UNLV in 1983.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Becoming Protestant. Now, mind you, well, my caveat here, Frank, is I'm catching up to where you are, but I want to ask you a couple of things. So first of all, the wisdom of discernment, Pope Francis observed, redeems the necessary ambiguity of life and helps us to find the most appropriate means, which do not always coincide with what looks great and strong. So, Frank, I want to ask you, what's fascinating about your story is, originally I was going to ask you a little bit about kind of where did Catholic schools go wrong? Given what you were hungry for, what you were searching for, you were groomed from K through 12 and then beyond in these many Catholic institutions. I mean, obviously you went to Princeton and other UNLV and so on, but you had an immersion in the Catholic environments of education and so on. And yet, the more I listen to you, the more I realize, my gosh, you have been God haunted. And wrestling with God in his different manifestations and the different intellectual strains that he presents your entire life. I mean, throughout your experience in school and out of school and so on. So you're a story, and mind you, we'll talk about how you obviously you fell away, agnostic, entered the Protestant fold, come back to the Catholic fold. But it's quite the story of somebody who never you never shook God. And I love the notion of being the suitor that's kind of putting on airs and so on, when in fact, you're kind of constantly thinking about this person, or you're thinking about God. So do you want to say a little something about that, about you've never let go of the hunt for the depths that God has to offer. Would you affirm what I'm saying that? And secondly, what could you say to the people out there that are haunted by God and they're still on their search right now? Any advice you'd give to them?
Yeah. So I think, I quote St. Augustine in the piece, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And so the one thing that I think I've always been looking for, and I'm still looking for in a sense, I think until we encounter God in the beatific vision, there's really no rest. I mean, this is something that that I've learned much better as a Catholic, that life involves a struggle to become holy, a struggle to seek oneness with God, which we can never get here on this side of eternity. So to those that are struggling or are uncertain about belief, I think the thing that you have to realize is that you are going to have a sense of joy and I think better understanding once you make the ascent to faith. But the struggle and the seeking for perfect rest is never going to end. Yeah. One of the things that one of the mistakes I think that was made when I was a youngster, at least in terms of the evangelical world, and you still hear this today among some evangelicals, and that is, God has God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, which is or something along. I think I probably got it slightly wrong.
Yeah.
It's actually was coined by Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, who was a wonderful man. But God does have a plan for your life, but you know what? It may not always be wonderful.
Yeah, good one.
There are martyrs. There are people that have suffered for their faith. I mean, St. Augustine, towards the end of his life, lived long enough to see the barbarians inside the gates.
Yeah.
So it may not end wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, it's going to end wonderful in the sense that you will have union with God. But I think the idea that, there's a lot of kind of early Christian pop music, and I mean the early sort of contemporary Christian pop music. It's like, Keith Green, who I loved, he was one of the great Christian pop artists, very original music. I loved his music, but he in one of his songs, he says, "Where do all the bad feelings go? Like, you put this love in my heart," and he gives the impression in that music, it's like, once you become a Christian, all your problems will fade away.
Yeah.
And that is just not true.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's not about, a kind of Norman Vincent Peale kind of pitch. It's about becoming holier, becoming more like the divine.
Yeah.
And that may involve suffering. It doesn't mean that there isn't joy. There is joy. There's a sense of better understanding the plan of God. But there's also a kind of acceptance that we are, in fact, finite creatures, that we don't know everything, that there will be struggles, that there will be disappointments. That's just part of life. And that I do think the thing that the faith has helped me better understand is that it's not about me. So the one thing as a kind of evangelical public intellectual that's changed for me as a Catholic is that when I was in the evangelical world, I always felt as if I needed to have an argument for everything, that I needed to have an answer for everything, that I don't feel that way as a Catholic. I feel as if I died tomorrow, that the church would go on fine without me.
Good one. Good one.
That
we'd miss you though. We'd miss you.
and I'm not saying that we don't have obligations and duties, and that each of us is not important. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that as members of the body of Christ, that, we have to understand that it's just not about each of us as individuals, that it's part that we are, in fact, suffering with Christ for the good of the church.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to say these things because we live in a society and sort of a culture that, at least in terms of religion, oftentimes presents faith as all about, here's this wonderful thing and it'll make you feel good. And that's just not, I think, an accurate depiction of the nature of faith.
It was, I think, C.S. Lewis and Chesterton individually and independently articulated the joy they felt in recognizing that they were not made for this earth, that they were made for someplace else. And it was almost, to your point, they're being able to rest comfortably in the notion that they're restless here on earth. That we long for something else, that we don't arrive at perfection here on earth, because perfection isn't for earth. It is for the heavens. It is for the end when we do reunite with Christ. And it's interesting because I think about all the utopian movements that tried to render paradise here and now, and there's a danger in a theological, a Christian mindset that wants to, as Eric Vogelin would say, immanentize the eschaton, to render here and now that which is the end or that which is perfect. And I think this is such a vital point. And I will tell you, it's also something that brought me into the Catholic Church as a convert in 2010, is the notion that suffering will come. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's not to make us despondent and pessimistic and so on and so forth. But the issue isn't whether we will suffer. It is yes, we will suffer in one form or the other, maybe many forms, but the long and the short of it is we have to cope with suffering, we have to grow through suffering, and we have to have faith in the midst of suffering. And that's where I find the writings of Flannery O'Connor, the writings of George Bernanos, some of Evelyn Waugh's works that are difficult, the Inferno, Dante's Inferno, racking you with the notion that this is hard. And I think that there are people out there that sort of walk away from faith when all they get is the balloons and puppet theater and sunshine and lollipops side of faith, because they're like, this isn't reckoning with the actual gnawing, aching, searing pain I have. And so I think surrendering to the mystery of the Catholic notion that we can't wrap it all up in a tight bow here on earth, but it all comes to good, when we meet God face to face. And I think you're articulating that, having been on the Protestant side of the fence and now back to the Catholic side of the fence, is a balm to people who are wondering, when it isn't sunshine and lollipops, what do I have to hold on to? And what I'm hearing you say is you hold on to your Catholic faith because it wrestles with this stuff more than any other worldview out there, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the attempt to domesticate God, which is a real modern reflex, ultimately leads to a kind of unbelief. So let me explain what I mean here. So if, one of the criticisms that's often leveled against the way in which the Catholic Church will talk about its view of God and the divine nature is that, the Catechism says that God is, in fact, incomprehensible, that we can only speak of him analogically and not univocally. And so you find a lot of people, especially in my discipline, Christian philosophers, who will say, well, no, we can come up with ways to explain God's actions. And in the process of doing that, they sort of take out the mystery. And I think my thinking is that, and maybe this is just the consequence of just age, I don't want to know everything. I mean, the mystery is the thing that draws me. I don't want to worship a God I can understand.
Good one.
Like, I just don't get that. Like, to me, it's mind boggling. Like, my wife and I joke once in a while, she'll tell me something and I said, let's keep the mystery in the marriage,
Yeah.
And she'll laugh. We've been married long enough where we can, joke like that. And,
yeah.
and, I think the same thing about our relationship to God, that, some, philosophers will say, well, the fact that, God's attributes seem mysterious counts against it. I think, no, that's what makes it so attractive. And it's maybe just the consequence of living long enough to go through different things and to become better acquainted with the tradition. I mean, this is the thing that I find all kind of mysterious is how much of what we've inherited from our predecessors is not used to help us better understand our plight today. Or, to take it even further, how many people who, when they discover it, or let me put it this way, they don't discover it, they think they've thought of it anew,
yeah,
and they realize they don't realize it had been talked about for generations. It's almost as if they were born on third base and they thought they hit a triple. And I consider, look, I think of my own journey in those terms. There's so many things that I discovered in my 40s about Catholicism. And here I was a philosopher who did his PhD at a Catholic university, Fordham. Yeah. Now, of course, I was in philosophy. I wasn't in theology. And so there wasn't really many opportunities for me to dig very deeply into the Catholic theological tradition. But here I was in my mid-40s discovering things that the church had taught, thinking, how come I didn't know that?
Yeah. It's funny because this is opening chapter of Chesterton's Orthodox. I thought I was ahead of the times and only realized that I was 1,800 years behind the Catholic Church. It's an incredible, and I also love it is wonderful for a storied academic like yourself to admit humbly to the notion that you have still much to learn and that you'll never know it all, and that you embrace that. I mean, I think the notion that a person in academia who is always about seeking answers and probing, you'll never stop seeking answers, you'll never stop probing, but you have the humility enough to recognize that God is not your creation. He is not something that now you just put your finishing touches on understanding him and you understand all that there is. If God is who he is, he's ineffable, endless, and omni everything. And so that as an academic and a Catholic is an extraordinary admission. I also want to say, if people get a chance, go read Walt Whitman's When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, the poem, which speaks exactly to, Frank, what you're saying. The guy sitting in the room listening to the astronomer, with charts and diagrams and math and everything. And the listener gets tired and sick till rising and gliding out, wandered off by himself into the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. The notion of just sometimes we got to step away from all of our constructs and our algorithms and our explanations and just look in awe and wonder at the night stars. You put your finger on that so very well. Segment 4, not very convincing. I found myself thinking more and more like a Catholic, Frank Beckwith tells us, so much so that I would often be asked by friends and relatives why I wasn't Catholic. The most poignant of these incidents occurred at an academic conference at Boston College in early 2006 during the Q&A session following a talk I gave on the essential role of the early creeds in the development of Christian doctrine. A member of Boston College's philosophy faculty told the audience that I'd made a great case for the necessity of the church's magisterium. She then asked me, "Why aren't you Catholic?" Although I offered a response, my recollection is that it was not very convincing. So, Frank, tell us about this.
Yeah, so this was 2006. I was invited to give a talk at this conference at Boston College by two friends of mine in the philosophy department. It was a conference about John Paul II and kind of applied philosophy. So I, at that time, I had just recently read, or actually reread, I had read in the 90s when it came out, Fide Ratio, and I had reread Fide Ratio for an article that I was asked to write for the magazine Touchstone, right after the death of John Paul II. And so it was, in that time I was writing as an evangelical. It was sort of an evangelical appreciation for John Paul II. So I wrote this very small piece about Fide Ratio and John Paul II's criticism of what he calls biblicism. So it was right around that time that they asked me to write a paper and deliver it at this conference. And so I thought, I'm going to talk about how the Catholic creeds, which is something that John Paul II mentions in the encyclical, and how philosophy played a role in the development of Catholic doctrine and ultimately the creeds. And so I deliver the paper, and at the conference, there's actually about a half a dozen Baylor doctoral students in the audience. And there's 500 people there. I give the paper. There's a question and answer period. And way back is one of the two faculty members that had invited me, and she raises her hand and raises that question. And the answer I gave this lame answer. But, you reach a point in your career as a public speaker, you're able to kind of wing it. Like you can sort of come up with stuff that's kind of half-baked and it still sounds plausible. At least it sounded plausible to me. But I remember, though, afterwards that it really, really affected me. Yeah. And so I spent, actually, several months later, I'd gone through, there was a kind of an internal dispute at Baylor. I had gone through a long tenure fight. And so, and as well as being the chair of the upcoming annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. So I was really busy with having to evaluate 500 paper or abstract submissions for papers to be delivered at this conference. And then I had this tenure fight that I wound up winning. And it was after that I had to explore, I felt compelled to explore the question that had been raised at that conference by that faculty member. And that led me to actually ask questions to several friends who were Catholic. And one of those friends, somebody who I don't mention in the article, just for lack of space, was Jay Budziszewski. Jay Budziszewski is a philosopher at the University of Texas. He's got an appointment in both philosophy and government departments. And Jay is a convert. In 2003, he returned to the Catholic, or not returned, he became Catholic. And I ran into Jay and his wife at a conference at the University of Dallas. And my wife was with me, and we had breakfast with Jay and Sandra. And my wife asked Jay, "Why did you become Catholic?" And that led to a 3-hour lunch. That was, I think, early December 2006. And Jay encouraged me to read the Church Fathers on the 4 issues that were sticking points for me in my returning to the church. And they were the doctrine of penance, justification, apostolic succession, and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And for me, those were 4 issues that I really had difficulty with. And he said, "Look, read the Church Fathers on those 4 issues." And I did. I actually had a set of the writings of the Church Fathers that I had bought when I was 19 years old. And I bought it because I had Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons knocking on my door. And I wanted to show both the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, who I would invite into my home, that the doctrine of God that I accepted, the doctrine of the Trinity and the eternality of God, which Mormons technically reject, was taught in the early church. But I had never read the Church Fathers on those issues that divided Protestants and Catholics. In fact, one of the things that came out of that, or what I think is an insight that came out of that reading, was this, that on the issues that Protestants and Catholics disagree on today, namely the 4 issues that I mentioned: apostolic succession, penance, real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and the doctrine of justification, there were no ecumenical councils called to resolve those issues. But ironically, the issues over which we are not divided, Trinity, deity of Christ, councils were called. And so I thought that was kind of weird, that wow, it turns. And so that was one of the things that I thought was kind of strange, that if these were, they were only contested after the 16th century. And so one reason why, for example, you don't have a church father say something like, I'm going to deal with the issue of justification, or I'm going to give a robust defense of apostolic succession, is that everyone took it for granted.
Yeah.
So Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, just actually says one of the marks of the church is that it believes in apostolic succession. And it was a way to sort of shame the heretics, right? So that was one thing that really came out of that study, was that the things over which we don't disagree today were the actual issues that required ecumenical councils, and the issues over which we disagree, everybody kind of took for granted.
It's amazing.
And so that was something that was a real kind of paradigm shift for me. And so and I also read evangelicals on these issues as well. And one of them that I read was a now retired history professor from the University of Notre Dame, Mark Knoll. He co-authored this book called Is the Reformation Over?, where he goes through with his co-author the Catholic Catechism. And he basically says at the end that evangelicals can agree with roughly 90% of the Catholic Catechism. And so that kind of jarred me a bit.
Yes.
And then I read the book review of Is the Reformation Over by Carl Trueman.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote that in my essay.
Yes.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to read.
That was my next question. Okay. So please.
So this is what Carl says in his review of Is the Reformation Over?, which appeared on the website of Reformation 21, which is an organization of Protestant Reformed Protestant thinkers and writers. He says, every year I tell my Reformation history class that Roman Catholicism is, at least in the West, the default position. Rome has a better claim to historical continuity and institutional unity than any Protestant denomination, let alone the strange hybrid that is evangelicalism. In the light of these facts, therefore, we need good, solid reasons for not being Catholic. Not being a Catholic should, in other words, be a positive act of will and commitment, something we need to get out of bed, determined to do each and every day. It would seem, however, that if the authors are correct, many who call themselves evangelical really lack any good reason for such an act of will. And the obvious conclusion, therefore, should be that they do the decent thing and rejoin the Roman Catholic Church.
Wow.
So I read that, and I immediately in my soul, the burden changed.
Wow.
That it shifted from the church had to prove itself to me to I have to prove myself to the church. In other words, I need to have the reason of why I am in schism with the church in which my parents had baptized me. Yeah. And the church that gave me First Holy Communion and that imparted to me the grace of the sacrament of confirmation. I had to show why I was in schism. And so at that point, it was a couple of days later, soon afterwards, I'm not sure how many days it was exactly, I went to my wife and I said, I want to return to the Catholic Church. And her immediate answer was, what took you so long? and the reason for that is that she had actually been drawn to the church many years earlier. And she's not a theologian or a philosopher. She is a stained glass artist who just loved the beauty of the liturgy. That was it for her. She wasn't really interested in the issues that interested me. But when I arrived at Baylor in 2003, Baylor, as some, if not many of your listeners know, is a Christian university, a Baptist university, and you have to be a Christian to be on the faculty. or an observant Jew. We have a small segment of Jewish faculty on the at Baylor who attend synagogue. But you can be any sort of Christian. And for that reason, there's about 10 to 15% of the faculty out of the over 1,000 faculty members who are Catholic. And when you come to Baylor and are interviewed, you're asked about what church you belong to, what your faith is. And so it turns out that the Catholics at Baylor are kind of serious versions of Catholicism. So I was surrounded for the first time in my career by not only serious Catholics, but serious Protestants of all sorts. And so I had to think for the first time in quite a while, well, where do I fit? I mean, there's this line in Mere Christianity where C.S. Lewis says, you can't stay in the corridor. You have to pick a room. Yeah. And so the corridor is Mere Christianity. And so you have to pick a room. And of course, the room he picked was Anglicanism. But, so I, began thinking for the first time in quite a while about where I belonged. And I do credit my coming to Baylor as being instrumental in raising those questions. So we went to our local priest, Father Timothy Favorick, who at that time was pastor of St. Joseph's Catholic Church in a community adjacent to Waco called Belmead. And we had known him since we arrived at Baylor in 2003. And he immediately went into priest mode. So we're sitting there in his office and he says, okay, he says, do you affirm everything taught by the Catholic Church without any reservation? And I said, yes, I do. He says, okay, the only thing you have to do is to go to confession because you've been baptized, confirmed, and you received First Holy Communion. He says, but Frankie has to go to RCIA. Sure. Because she's only been baptized as a Protestant. And so, but she got to be received in a few months later, but I had to promise to go to RCIA with her. Sure. So that was the condition. So a week later, I went to confession for the first time since the late 1970s. Wow. And I walked into the confessional. I went to a church close to our home. And I said, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been nearly 3 decades or over 3 decades since my last confession. And I said, I can't remember all my sins. And so he was from East India. And he said, just give me general categories. and that was the first time that then I was received back into the church. And technically, I was at that time president of the Evangelical Theological Society. And so I wrote a letter to all the members of the executive committee of ETS and told them what I had done. And a week later, I resigned as president of ETS. I mean, so I actually thought I could stay on as president because ETS has a very thin statement of belief. It just requires to believe the infallibility of Scripture and the Trinity. And as a Catholic, obviously, I believe both of those. But I realized after talking to some former presidents as well as some friends that it wasn't a good idea because for the next 6 months prior to the meeting, all that people would be talking about would be my presidency, and then I would have to give a presidential address at a banquet full of people who may not be full. So it just wasn't. It would have caused scandal. It was imprudent, and so I decided to resign.
Did you find that the people that you were, your colleagues and so on, even though this decision was made to step away, were people congratulatory? Were they skeptical? Were they understanding? What was your general sense of the vibe you were getting from those you worked with in these circles?
It was all over the place. I'd say a vast majority of them were very kind. I remember one friend of mine, Gretchen Passantino, she's now since passed away, her and her husband, Bob, were both Lutherans. And she wrote my wife and I a very nice letter saying, I remember telling Bob back in the late 90s, oh, Frank and Frankie are going to become Catholic someday. and she says, we welcome, Bob had passed away by this time. And she said, she had since been remarried. She said, me and Pat, that was her husband, we welcome you to the great liturgical traditions. They went to a Lutheran church that was sort of high church. And then there were a few evangelicals that wrote me privately and said that they didn't agree with what I had done, but they still considered me a brother in Christ. So there were, and that is fine. I mean, I actually think that I had great respect for people who take theology seriously. I'd rather have someone tell me that I'm wrong than saying we really don't all disagree. We really all agree anyways. I think that I'd rather have someone say, that they believe in theological truth and that I'm wrong. I think that's a much better position from which to dialogue. Yeah. So I had one friend who's a philosopher at a Baptist school who wrote me, whose son was a philosophy major in our department, who said, I don't agree with what you did, but I'm honored that my son is studying with you. And so there was some very kind things said. Now online, there were things said that were pretty vicious.
Yeah, of course.
By people that I really didn't know well. That was, that's the way it goes. In fact, it got to the point where I had put in a Google alert with my name to see one morning I got up and there were 10,000 alerts. And it's like, it's weird how this psychologically, how this happens. If 20 people say bad things about you on those days, blogs were big, social media was virtually nothing. Yeah. So if 50 people or 20 people say bad things about you on blogs, you get really upset. Yeah. But if 10,000 say things, it's like it doesn't matter. It's like you just, so
less personal.
Yeah. So it's weird how and I wouldn't have expected that. And it was all over the place. And I literally have on my hard drive, I saved every single email sent to me. And I responded to literally every single one. It took me 18 months. And I got emails from people like cardinals and archbishops, people I didn't know. Avery Cardinal Dulles wrote me, and people like that. And I was really floored just by the outpouring of support by Catholics, many Catholics who I knew, who I've known for many years. I was one of the founding members of University Faculty for Life in 1991. It was founded at Georgetown University. And I think I was one of only, there were 20 of us that were part of the founding group. And I think it was one of 2 non-Catholics who were part of it. And all those Catholics knew that I'd grown up in the church, and they always treated me with respect and never. And so I think I look back at that had a real profound influence on me, that just those relationships and getting to see Catholics who took their faith seriously. And I think that those examples meant as much to me as any of the arguments. And I think of my parents, who have now, since they lived long enough to see me return to the church. Yeah. They were not theologians or philosophers. My father was an accountant. My mother was a homemaker who worked with my father when he had his tax business. So she eventually was certified as a tax preparer. And they simply, when I was a kid, let me do this. And never once criticizing me. They put me in contact with people they thought would help, but they still loved me. And they set a wonderful example. When I was growing up, they took in relatives that had, because of family problems, needed a place to stay. So we had in our home cousins and others that lived with us. And so one of my uncles would jokingly refer to our home as Boys Town. and so they lived out their faith. And I think their example, had a deep influence on me too, as well as my grandmother, who I lived with while I was studying at Fordham University. I had my mother was Sicilian, and her mother was obviously Sicilian as well, and so I lived with my Sicilian grandmother, who was a daily mass communicant, and she knew that I had obviously left the church, and I found out years after that she had actually contacted one of my professors at Fordham, who was a devout Catholic, Dominic Balestra. And when Dominic found out that I had returned to the church, he wrote me this note telling me of the story of my grandma confronting him, saying, when are you going to get my grandson back in the church? And he said, I think your grandson is a good Christian, and that grace will bring him back. And sure enough, I think it did.
St. Monica moment. It sounds kind of like, this is so wonderful, Frank. I have two questions left for you. One is, what from the Protestant experience do you bring with you into the Catholic Church?
I think the concern, I think a couple of things. I'm concerned. I still have a evangelistic fervor. Mm-hmm. I do feel an obligation, a calling to provide answers to people who have questions about the faith. There's that passage in 1 Peter, be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you with humility. That I still think is there. It's something that actually originally drew me to philosophy. I was interested in these questions of faith and reason. And I one of the things evangelicals, I think, are really good at is being able to articulate to ordinary churchgoers theological ideas. And I do think that that's something that I think Catholics can learn from evangelicals. And I think you see things like what Word on Fire does, I think, is an example of a kind of Catholic manifestation of that type of way of thinking of the church's ministry to its members. I think what you see places like Steuben Franciscan University has the summer thing, so I do think that evangelicals are very good at that. I do think that the reading of Scripture, evangelicals are very oriented towards the written word. And I do think one thing that I think has really significantly changed for me is I probably read the Bible more as a Catholic than I did as an evangelical. And that sounds kind of weird because the stereotype is, evangelicals read the Bible. Yeah. And Catholics don't. It's like there's a joke that I tell when I'm in front of Catholic groups, and sometimes I don't get a laugh, so maybe I should stop using it. I say, I quote something from the Bible. I said that's in the Bible. Do you know what that is? And they, but I think one of the things that's changed. I mean, I obviously read the Bible as an evangelical, but I would kind of read the Bible more for proof texting my doctrines, than reading it, especially those aspects of it that are narrative. Yeah. And I think that's changed a lot. I think reading Catholic authors and commentaries on Scripture has helped me read the Bible as it was written, not as a kind of place to mine for doctrine. And I think that's a bad habit that some Catholics have that habit too. But I do think it's something that's dominates the evangelical world. So you get a lot of emphasis on word study and etymology, which I'm skeptical about whether that's the right way to do theology. But I do think evangelicals are quite good at articulating and presenting Scripture in ways that are attractive and compelling. So I think that's something that I think Catholics can learn from evangelicals.
Very good. Frank, your story is just a wonderful sweeping story of somebody who is in love with God and on the search to arrive home. And clearly it seems that you have. I want you, as you look back, and obviously you have much life ahead of you, much miles to go before you sleep and promises to keep and so on. But when you reflect on where you've been in this journey, how would you describe God's grace in your life? Where have you seen his grace most visibly and most vibrantly?
I consider it, and I want a kind of thin string of providence. I mean, I see these. I mean, I can't believe that I'm actually. I mean, if you would ask my 19-year-old self, who was a new philosophy major, I wanted to be a professor.
Yeah,
I would have been satisfied, earning my PhD and having a job at a small college, teaching students and not really caring that much about publishing or writing or anything like that. That was sort of, but if you had told me that, you would be a full professor at a Research One university and have, all these books and articles, and I wouldn't have believed it. Like I sometimes say, and I've said this line many times, that I feel as if like the Beatles are on stage and Ringo goes to the bathroom and I take his place on the drums and the other Beatles don't notice.
Oh, good one.
I just like, I'm floored that I think about the people I've had the opportunity to meet and know.
Yeah.
Like, I can't believe it. And it's, and I'm not, I don't want to lose that. I mean, I still want to maintain a kind of childlike awe of what's happened. I think back, I was not a great student in high school. In fact, one of the maybe the greatest honor I've ever had was to be invited in 2011 to give the commencement address at my high school.
Oh, wow.
A Bishop Moorman High School in Las Vegas. And I talked to the students about the history of the school, things that I did not actually know until I was preparing for my commencement address, that the school was formed created by a group of Catholics that had moved to Las Vegas who had moved from mostly New York and Chicago and Ohio to work not virtually none of them worked in the casino industry. They were there for the test site and eventually for Howard Hughes, who had Hughes Air was there. And how they had created a neighborhood adjacent to what eventually became Bishop Gorman High School, which was a planned community called Maryville. I didn't even know the name of it.
Wow.
And it was named after the Blessed Mother. And I told the kids the story. But the other thing I said to the kids, I said, I'm going to talk to the kids here who have not received any honors or scholarships because I was you. I now am a professor at a university that if I had applied with my record today would not get in.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I'm blown away about is how, despite my youthful distractions that led me away from not being a very good student until I was in college, that I still was able to get into a very good doctoral program, that eventually I went to law school at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm just amazed that the Lord imparted enough grace to me and put in my path individuals that I would have never intentionally gone out of my way to encounter. I'm floored by it. And, I am, grateful.
That's wonderful. Awe and wonder, it's an extraordinary story, and your work, your writing, your teaching, obviously to your students, but and your writing for us it's been a grace, Frank. I want to point people to the winter issue, 2023 winter issue of Evangelization and Culture, which is dedicated to the theme of conversion. Frank has one of the feature essays, excellent essay on reversion. So if you want to explore more about his story, some of the themes we discussed today, it's there for the taking. Frank Beckwith, professor, author, and Catholic revert. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
So I've been thinking, although I enjoyed the engaging and wide-ranging conversation with Professor Frank Beckwith, I have to admit that one of my favorite parts of his reversion story involves his experience at an academic conference at Boston College in 2006. After Frank had made an excellent case for the necessity of the Catholic Church's magisterium, a Boston College philosophy professor winsomely but puckishly asked him, "So why aren't you Catholic?" Recalling this moment like a lightning strike, Beckwith offered an answer that he himself admitted was not very convincing. Once, in response to a lame answer, William F. Buckley quipped, "I won't insult your intelligence by suggesting you believe what you just said." Frank Beckwith offered a lame answer, and his life was changed because of it. Many people stand at the threshold of the church, but never quite cross over. The reasons for this are legion. I wasn't raised Catholic. It is unfamiliar to me. It may upset my friends and family. I disagree with this or that stance, this or that teaching, this or that priest or pope. But how many fail to enter the church because of a lame answer? Perhaps this is because we fail to think. The world conspires against introspection. When considering the permanent things, such as the dignity of our lives, the calling we answer, the suffering we endure, and the grace we are granted, we allow ourselves to be distracted or derailed by petty concerns and ephemeral anxieties. And when a moment alights where we can truly reflect upon God's role in our lives and the place where we can meet Him with joy and contrition, reconciliation and grace, the devil interferes. He whispers that the place where Christ and His sacraments are forever present, the Catholic Church, is antiquated, bigoted, or simply irrelevant to our daily lives. Get back to thinking about what really matters, Satan says, like that grudge you have against the church, the football game this weekend, or what you are planning for dinner tonight. But Frank Beckwith was bothered by his lame answer to an infinitely important question. Why aren't you Catholic? In fact, his lame answer led to a culminating moment of honesty with himself. Eternal questions, like the fate of our souls, matter too much for us to be satisfied with our own lame answers. In his novel, The Moviegoer, Walker Percy talks about those who have found and are engaged in the search, as opposed to those who are blithely, unconsciously trapped in everydayness. If you refuse to settle for and surrender to lame answers surrounding your faith, you will truly be engaged in the search. And the search is what life is about. It most commonly leads to God and to the Catholic Church. It leads to truth and solace, scripture and the sacraments. What a wonderful path. What a striking existence that emerges out of it. G.K. Chesterton was right. The moment a man ceases to pull against the Catholic Church, he feels a tug towards it. The moment he ceases to shout it down, he begins to listen to it with pleasure. The moment he tries to be fair to it, he begins to be fond of it. Frank Beckwith's journey, his search, away from and back to the Catholic Church was long and meandering. Indeed, it was straight with crooked lines, but in the end, it was edified by a lame answer to an honest question. Why aren't you Catholic? If your answer to that eternal question is not very convincing, if your answer is lame, then why aren't you Catholic? And one last thing. Because we have referenced its excerpt several times, I would like to recommend G.K. Chesterton's The Catholic Church and Conversion. Written from a convert's own pen, Chesterton unfolds the common misgivings and brilliant rebuttals to a soul skeptically but earnestly exploring the church and its teachings. Chesterton's gift is his winsome wit, twinned with his uncanny insight. We do not really want a religion that is right where we are right, Chesterton writes. What we want is a religion that is right where we are wrong. We do not want, as the newspapers say, a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. Once you have partaken in Chestertonian wisdom, you'll forever want more, not only of Chesterton, but you'll forever want more of the Catholic Church. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.